Welcome to STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Welcome to STEM Talk, where we introduce you to fascinating people who passionately inhabit the scientific and technical frontiers of our society.
Hi, I'm Marcus Baumann, a senior research scientist at IHMC. I'm co-hosting today with Dr. Ken Ford.
Hi, Marcus. It's good to be here with you.
Our guest today is Dr. Dan Pardi, the CEO of humanOS.me, a digital health training application. Dan is well known for his research into sleep and has collaborated with high-performing organizations across Silicon Valley, VCs such as the Mayfield Fund, Artist Ventures, companies like Adobe, Salesforce, Workday, Pandora, Intuitive Surgical, and more.
He also works with several branches of the United States military, including the Special Forces and Naval Special Warfare, to help elite warfighters maintain vigilant performance in both combat and non-combat conditions.
And Dan has a podcast, humanOS Radio. It's the official podcast of the Sleep Research Society, the Canadian Sleep Society, and it's a content partner with the Buck Institute on Aging. Dan collaborated with more than 100 science professors around the globe to create this digital humanOS application. Dan has a Ph.D. in cognitive neuroscience from Stanford University here in the U.S. He also did some of his research toward that degree in the Netherlands. He has a master's degree in exercise physiology from Florida State University, currently lives in Austin, Texas with his wife, 2 young boys, and their dog, Wally.
But before we get to our interview with Dan, we have some housekeeping to take care of. First, we really appreciate all of you who have subscribed to STEM Talk, and we are especially appreciative of all the wonderful 5-star reviews that are piling up.
And as always, the Double Secret Selection Committee has been continually and carefully reviewing iTunes, Google, Stitcher, and other podcast apps for the wittiest and most lavishly praise-filled reviews to read on STEM Talk. If you hear your review read on STEM Talk, just contact us at stemtalk@ihmc.us to claim your official STEM Talk t-shirt.
Today, our winning review was posted by someone who goes by the moniker Kurd Nerd, and the review is titled, "If You Need Me, I'll Be at the Gym." The review reads, "Thank you very much for this insightful STEM talk on Parkinson's disease. I currently have someone very close to me who has been diagnosed with Parkinson's, and I've watched it develop. Dr. Lavin's discussion truly helped me to better understand what people who have this chronic disease are going through at a deeper level, and learning the benefits of exercise at a genetic level as it pertains to things like Parkinson's and dementia was very eye-opening."
Thank you, Kurd Nerd, and thanks to all our other listeners who have helped STEM Talk become such a great success.
And now on to today's interview with Dr. Dan Pardi.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Well, I'm happy to join today to co-host this with Ken Ford. My name is Marcus Baumann, a senior research scientist at IHMC. So hello to you, Dan.
Nice to be here.
And hello, Ken.
Hello to you.
Okay, Dan, tell us a little bit about your growing up in Marin County in Northern California.
Marin is a beautiful place. It's nestled between San Francisco and Napa Valley. In fact, growing up, my uncle was a winemaker, and my dad made wine as well as a hobby. So we would, during the crush, go up there and stomp on grapes. It was a lot of fun. I grew up in Novato at the top of a very steep hill, and so that limited my interaction with other kids unless I wanted to ride 15 minutes straight uphill. We had a lot of wild animals around. I had deers sleeping on the wall right next to my bedroom, and we'd have 30 raccoons that would come visit us every night, and eventually we learned how to feed them by hand, but it's a great place to grow up.
Sounds idyllic. You and your father shared a passion for building radio-controlled cars. Could you tell us about that? That's an interesting hobby. Earlier generations, I think it was slot cars.
Yeah, it's one of my fondest memories. We would go down to a hobby shop in San Anselmo, and we would pick out a car. We liked cars from Tamiya, which is a Japanese manufacturing company that started in the 1940s, and they would make these very fast radio-controlled cars. So we would choose one. We built ones like the Frog, the Supercharger, the Hornet, and they would take a while to build. They would take sometimes all day or multiple days. And that was actually part of the fun, just being with my dad and figuring out how to put these together. And then we would go find some dirt lot and see how fast we could get them to go. But it was really nice father-son time.
What size were these cars?
They're over a foot wide and And
big cars.
Yeah, they'd go quite fast. When I was that age, they seemed like they would go as fast as a regular car, but they'd go up to 40 miles an hour.
Well, in scale, that's pretty fast.
It's pretty fast.
Sounds fantastic. So your dad grew up in Queens, I understand.
Yeah.
And after becoming successful as a salesman for Remco, selling kitchenware, he was able to move to California and build his own company. He had about 200 employees. And in the U.S., he was one of the primary importers and distributors of products from companies like Sony, Hitachi, and others. You said one of the lessons that he imparted to you, my understanding, is the value of relationships. Can you talk a little bit about that lesson? Tell us how it's translated your life.
John Pardi was a very warm and personable man, and I always viewed him as a business savant growing up. He inspired a lot of loyalty in the people that worked with him, so much so that we'd go to the Consumer Electronics Show in Vegas when I was a kid, and people would come up to me and share just how enthusiastic they were to work with him, and it always made an impression on me. I was very proud. He always taught me to seek win-win relationships, that if it's not a good partnership for the other person or the other side, it's not really worth doing in aggregate. If you look at across all those relationships, it's too much trouble. And so it's in your self-interest to think selflessly and think about how the other party benefits. And most people think just about what they might get out of a relationship, or many do. And so that definitely made an impression on me and is with me to this day.
Though you were by admission a middling sort of skateboarder and a good soccer player as a kid, right? It was basketball that really captured you. Can you tell us about how basketball, especially your time at Cap 11 camp, really changed your life?
Yeah. Since I was young, I've always had hobbies that I did for fun, and then others that I did to really get better at. And it's fun, even with hobbies that have a more casual relationship with, to get better still. But clearly I would use them to just have fun with it. And I didn't have the same level of dedication. Basketball, once I found it in 6th grade, became something that I became obsessed with practicing. I wanted to get better. And I went to a basketball camp called Cap 11, which changed my life. Cap 11 was the player of the decade in San Francisco high school basketball, went on to teach English at Drake High School in San Anselmo. His son ended up winning the state championship for Division II in California. And those players ended up being my first exposure to coaches in basketball. And they had a culture of winning that was passed down to me. You worked so hard at those camps. It was a sleepaway camp. You'd arrive on Sunday night and you'd play basketball from 6 a.m. until sometimes 10 p.m. By Tuesday, you were questioning whether or not you could actually make it to the end of the week. But you did, and everybody did. And so it had a boot camp style feel. And I remember when I was young, when I first went, when I came back, I was a different person. I remember my mom asked me, Dan, can you take out the garbage? And this was after I got back from the camp. And I said, Mom, it's already done. And I just really accelerated my maturity. And that stuck with me. That hard work stuck with me for the rest of my life.
Another great lesson.
Yeah,
absolutely. So let's switch to science and a little bit about your background. We ask all of our guests how they became interested in science. My understanding is that your science life began in 7th grade with a science fair project that ended up landing you a job with Nike. Auspicious beginning. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it was in relationship to my passion, which was basketball. So at the time, I was very interested in shoes, and I did a science fair project where I tested the energy return systems of different shoes. Converse, Reebok, Nike. Is what I had people who entered into the study do is jump up for 60 seconds and touch a distance that was 8 inches above the top of their reach. And then report, I would count how many times they could touch that point and then how they felt afterwards. So it was objective and subjective. Not necessarily the best study, but I sent it up to Nike in Beaverton, Oregon, and they ended up giving me a job as a tester. So they would send me shoes prior to them coming out in the marketplace. And so my coolest moment as a kid, I was given a pair of Nikes in a color that hadn't yet been released. And so walking into basketball practice in 7th grade, that was, probably the coolest I've ever felt.
You went to the University of San Francisco for your bachelor's degree and then on to Florida State University for your master's degree in exercise physiology. What precipitated the move across the country to Florida State?
A professor of mine at USF had a connection at FSU. And when I looked into the program, they advertised it as a program that not only was in exercise physiology, which through my undergraduate, I figured out I was very interested in, but they also advertised it as being part sports nutrition. And I knew I was interested in that as well. When I got there, I worked harder than I ever had as a student. I found what really motivated me. And I was brought under the wing of 4 Ph.D. students where we would sit in rooms and draw out physiology and talk about it, debate it, talk about studies. And that was probably one of the best parts of that entire experience. Overall, it was great. I had great professors, but finding like-minded people that pushed me was a great experience there.
I can imagine. And after graduating, you returned to Northern California to do cancer research at the Preventative Medicine Institute. And that's, which town is that in?
That's in Sausalito.
Sausalito.
Yeah.
So you journeyed back across the country to Northern California.
Yeah.
And I've heard you refer to that experience as sort of a linchpin experience career-wise. What shift in your thinking occurred there, or is that not right?
That was a very interesting period of time. So this was what we were looking at was prostate cancer and a multifactorial lifestyle program to see if we could affect the internal hormonal milieu of these patients, which then led to better prostate cancer outcomes in a control group that underwent watchful waiting. So with prostate cancer, it's very slow growing. And so this group of controls were not doing anything active. And could we take 180 patients, put them under a lifestyle program and see better outcomes? That was the idea of the study. Once a week, 180 patients would come to a 7-hour intervention where they would visit an exercise physiologist. They would visit somebody that would help them with meditation and learn how to do it. They even had interpersonal counseling between them and their spouse. And so what I appreciated about the study was it wasn't trying to identify one particular lever within the prostate cancer process, but actually how can we harness all the things that matter, theoretically, that have evidence behind them to yield greater outcomes. I was there for a year, but that left an indelible mark on my thinking, and it was something that I knew I wanted to come back to eventually.
So from there, you worked in bioinformatics, a little bit of a shift.
Yeah.
Going to the biotech double twist where you were leveraging this new thing called the Internet Portal, right, to empower life science. Seems you were a little ahead of your time there. And from Double Twist, went to Jazz Pharmaceuticals, where you founded the Medical Affairs Department. Tell us more about that department and what Medical Affairs does in the pharma industry.
Yeah, so Medical Affairs is a newer department within the pharmaceutical industry, relatively. It used to be that research and development would identify compounds or they would in-license them. Those would kick over to clinical development where you go through phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials before submitting to the FDA. And at that point, a approved molecule would get handed over to the commercial arm of the business. And that created some vulnerabilities. There wasn't really scientific support in the post-marketing field. So Medical Affairs started to help with that. So I was the first member of the department for Jazz. Jazz is a $10 billion market cap company out of Palo Alto. And we created the department. So fleshing out what are the functions of the department, looking at scientific publications, research grants, education, like that. We grew the department to 25 different people. And I focused on scientific publications and particularly research grants during my time there. But it was great because part of what I did was reach out and speak with subject matter experts that were interested in using the drug that we had to facilitate sleep in their clinical population that was outside of what the drug was approved for, and to do it in a research context. So very, very stimulating. It enabled me to learn about a lot of new things, and that's why it stayed interesting for the decade I was there.
After working in the health industry for 10 years, roughly, you went back to pursue a Ph.D. at Leiden University and Stanford University. And I understand that this all happened because of a fateful trip to Moscow. Tell us about that trip.
Yeah, so while I was at Jazz, we developed a partnership with UCB in Europe. So they were our European distribution partner. And since I had become somewhat of an expert on the compound sodium oxybate, or GHB, they were hosting a advisory board for 12 neurologists that came from different countries within the European Union. And they decided to host this in Moscow. So it was a 7-day trip in 2008. And it was on that trip, we all got to know each other quite well. So we had a consolidated period of hard work every day, and then we would go out into Moscow and see the town. It was quite nice. And on that trip, I met a gentleman, Gert-Jan Lammers, whose work I had admired for quite some time. And we had opportunity for long walks together and to get to know each other. And when I had come back, I got an email that said, Dan, this might come as a great surprise, but how would you feel about doing a PhD with me in the Netherlands? And long story short, he and then Jed Black at Stanford collaborated to create a program for me. So I ended up getting the chance to work with two people at Stanford, Jed Black, who was the second director of the Stanford Sleep Program, and also Jamie Zeitzer, who ran the Zeitzer Circadian Biology Lab, and then an endocrinologist, Hanno Pell, and a neurologist, Gert-Jan Lammers, in the Netherlands. And it was a wonderful group of supporters. They were excellent to work with, pushed me, and also were very supportive too.
Okay, so let's switch gears and talk about your research specifically during your PhD training at the Zeitzer Circadian Biology Lab at Stanford, where you focused on gamma hydroxybutyrate, or GHB, and focused on sleep and ingestive behavior. What were you most interested to address in that research?
So while I was at Jazz, I had developed questions of my own that I was interested in answering. Part of my PhD wanted to directly address those, but it also wasn't where I saw my career heading. And so part of my PhD was wrapping up some studies on GHB, but then switching over to looking at the relationship between sleep and ingestive behavior or eating behavior the next day. And what I was most interested in looking at was how ecologically relevant amounts of sleep loss. So many sleep studies will give somebody one full night of total sleep deprivation and then test what happens to a variety of different parameters the next day, including how it affects eating. I wanted to look at what happens when people just miss a few hours of sleep per night, something that is much more common in society. So that's what I focused on.
And in that trial that you conducted, you enrolled 50 individuals, randomly assigned them, and manipulated their next day alertness by randomly assigning how much sleep they were, how much sleep time that they had. So what were the findings?
Yeah. So here, what I was most interested in looking at was the consequence of sleep loss. We know that when you don't get adequate sleep for you, but that can have a potent impact on a very sensitive marker, which is alertness or reaction time. So you can feel sleepy, which is subjectively how you feel, and you can also have slower reaction time, which is a more objective way to measure your sleepiness. So what we did is we randomly assigned people to get more or less sleep just as a way to then tinker with the amount of alertness that they had the next day. In the baseline session, we'd have people come in, we would then give them a battery of cognitive tests, and then there was a quote unquote break. And here we did not let them know that we were monitoring the food that they ate, but we put out a variety of what I called grabbable food. So stuff that you can graze on, gummy bears, nuts, stuff that actually had a range of healthfulness to them. So stuff that was clearly highly palatable, stuff that might have been more healthy. What we tested was how these people, we asked questions, how helpful do you think this food type is? And then what we do is weigh and measure the different baskets of the food after to see where what they ate. And we used intentional misdirection. So I put the food down and say, okay, this is your break. I had everybody watch the same TED video during that break. And I said the same thing to everyone. They came in fasted, and I'd say, it's better to be full than still hungry by the end of this. And that's it. Then in 1 week, they were randomly assigned to get more or less sleep for one night. And they came in the next day, we tested their alertness, we asked them how sleepy they were, and then we did that part of the experiment again. So what we're looking at is, were there changes from the previous night's sleep in alertness the next day, and how did that correspond with what they consumed? And we found some pretty interesting things, that there were aspects of what they ate that corresponded with their sleepiness. And then there were different aspects of what they ate that corresponded to their reduction in reaction time. And what you see very interesting effects from sleep loss. One of them is effort discounting. You're less likely to make an effort towards something that you care about when you're sleepy. You get a case of the efforts, I say. I'll do it later. So that's one thing. We also see that it can be an optimism bias in economic preferences of an individual. So you're more likely to focus on the possible outcomes, benefits of something versus the possible downsides. You see this in gambling tasks, where people are focusing on what they could win and not the consequences of what they could lose, which is probably why casinos make a lot of money and serve weak drinks late in the night. You're artificially stimulated to be awake, but your brain is suffering from the consequences of extended sleep, wakefulness at that point of the day. You make different decisions as a result. And so this had our findings had lined up with other previous work that was done with fMRI studies, like one out of Mount Walker's lab, that showed that people prefer and seek highly palatable foods when they're even modestly sleep deprived. Well, their study was one total night of sleep deprivation, and we showed consistency with that, with even just a little bit of sleep loss. So we think about the impact of this on society. We know that obesity is a problem. We know that there's a correlation between sleep loss and obesity. And we also know that people are, 50% of the United States reports unsatisfied sleep. They're not quite getting the sleep that makes them feel fully refreshed the next day. How might that be impacting the problem that we see now with obesity in society? I think it's an important contributor. Certainly not the only thing that matters, but probably matters a lot.
That's very, very interesting. And, this idea of sort of grabbable foods, as you mentioned, I think about shift workers and the circadian disruptions and going back and forth from daytime with the kids and nighttime at work and within a week. And I can imagine how challenging that could be and may play a role in some of what we see in shift work.
And in the military,
Yes.
You're constantly out of phase with your normal life cycle. And sometimes, for a long period, my crew only operated at night. In fact, our patch said we get ours at night. And it was profound effects on behavior and health for 6 months. That's a long time to do that.
Yeah. Shift work, unfortunately, is quite common. There's classic shift work, which is, as you described, working at night. A lot of first responders, military have to do that. And then there's more modern style shift work where people might do something like this. They come home, they spend some time with their kids and have dinner, and then they go back to work after the kids are asleep a couple nights a week, and they work late at night. That's another form of shift work as well. And I know you've had Greg Potter on the show, who's a real expert at this topic. And so not only does sleepiness and sleep loss matter, but circadian timing has a really dramatic impact too on eating behavior and also the metabolism of food that you eventually do ingest.
Very interesting.
Absolutely. So while you were doing your PhD, you also did some things on the side, including developing your a behavioral model that you call the loop model to adopt and sustain health behaviors. You presented that model at several healthcare conferences, such as the Stanford Medicine X and Health 2.0. So what is this model?
Yeah, so at the beginning of my PhD, harkening back to my work with Dr. Ornish at Preventative Medicine Research Institute, I knew that I wanted to affect public health in some way. And in order to do that, you really do need to understand human behavior. So I took the first 6 months of my PhD and I dissected several well-known behavior models to see commonalities between them. So things like self-determination theory, theory of planned behavior, the trans-theoretical model. BJ Fogg, who is at Stanford, has the Persuasive Technology Lab, and he created a model called BMAT, which is behavior equals MAT, motivation, ability, and triggers. So anyway, I dissected those and then built my own. So behavior models can describe, predict, or explain why behavior changes. I wanted to put something together that was an actionable model we could then operationalize around. So the model is as follows. In order for people to adopt, pick up a new behavior, and then sustain it, they should know 4 things. Why should I do this? How do I do it? Am I doing it? And is it working? The why helps to set the direction of what you're trying to achieve. If you find something convincing or you have information that you didn't have before, like we're talking about with sleep, now you have information that you can seek out and set goals around. Am I doing it is more about turning that knowledge into behaviors that fit into your life, skills and behaviors. Some things are easier to adopt and some things take some training to then inculcate you with that knowledge that you can then use to guide your life. Then imagine a scenario where somebody goes through this form of training where they get educated and they learn some skills, but 7 months later, they're a lawyer, they're busy, and they get swept under the tide of their life. How can you then stay interactive with those ideas and monitor your own behaviors around them? I don't think that we should monitor every single thing, but having some connection to monitoring what you're living and whether or not that aligns with your ideals is helpful. And then lastly is, are we actually getting the results that you would hope for? And that's monitoring the trajectory of your health over time. So you look at the status, how does that compare to people my age? And then what is my trajectory over time? you can see that all of those 4 parts, you cannot replace one of them by more effort in another. You can't solve helping a person be aware of their daily practice by just giving them more information about the why. So you need to fulfill all those buckets to create somebody that has a more stable health practice. That's the idea.
That's a great idea, and it's comprehensive. Start with why.
Yeah. But don't end with why.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. So you now have this company that you started, humanOS.me, a digital health training application. What does digital health training mean?
Yeah. So if we think about education, it's not simply education. I like to put this in the context of something we're familiar with. Let's say soccer. Imagine if your coach sat you down and told you about soccer theory all day. It would be helpful, but it certainly wouldn't be enough. And so training is more than just knowledge acquisition. It is a whole motif about how an individual gets better at anything, guitar, soccer, martial arts. You have to then go through a process. Yes, education is involved. Skill development is involved. All of the feedback on how you're doing, all of that does matter. But we have to think of our health in the context of more of a dojo than just a library. So that's what humanOS has been, as how we think of what we're attempting to do. And the construction of humanOS was an operationalization of the loop model. So we have elements of the why, education. We have elements of turning that knowledge into skill. And then we have even elements of tracking. And so high level, the whole purpose is, can we make people more knowledgeable about information that exists in the world about their health? Can we make them more knowledgeable about themselves and their patterns? And can we empower them to put that knowledge into practice? That's our guiding purpose.
That's good. And as you alluded to earlier, simply giving people more information doesn't really seem to drive behavioral changes that we're looking for.
Yeah.
Could you talk about that and the role of the app?
Yeah. So the harsh lesson for me is my father passed away from cancer at age 59. At the time, I was working at the Preventative Medicine Research Institute doing cancer. So like anyone would, I did my best to try to help him. And at that time, I'd sit him down and I would tell him about the different connections between lifestyle and health to see if we could positively affect his trajectory. And he would be very proud of me and listen, but he never changed anything. And I realized that moment, if I want to have more of an impact, I need to understand behavior. So that was really the origin, right? That was the provenance of this entire idea. Now, when it comes to information, you also want to think about what your expectations are. So are we calibrating our own expectations for the individual to something that can be successful? It is easy to get overwhelmed with information. The internet has been wonderful in democratizing information, but now we suffer from a different problem, which is overwhelm. And so the way that we go about it is to what I call do principle-based learning. We teach a lot of information that we don't expect the person to remember. But the idea is to reinforce a concept that they do remember, that serves as a heuristic or something like commander's intent that helps them make good decisions in the face of real life. You're at the grocery store, you're at the breakfast table, you're at work. Can you refer to a principle that you now believe? And I think of belief not as a binary concept, but there's also the depth of belief. You might sit down and I tell you something that you hadn't heard before, and you're like, I believe that. But the more you learn it, that depth of belief can then serve to motivate you to really want to take part. And so our educational process is to efficiently put somebody in a better state of understanding, using detail to then reinforce the framework and the big concept, and then how to tie all those concepts together so they're in service of a North Star or a main principle. One of the problems with education, or we want to avoid disembodied knowledge, where you're learning these unconnected facts, because those facts then come and go. Can you teach people in a way where the facts then reinforce ideas? So the more you learn, the more solid your understanding of health and how to take actions on it is. That is the idea. That is the construction of the knowledge part of humanOS.
Very interesting. Do you see any downsides of tracking? You know, our STEM Talk listeners often ask us about the quality of the data, and some of our research customers have asked the same thing. But there's also the problem of becoming, in some cases, sort of hyper-focused or nearly compulsive about tracking things like sleep and food. which really ought to be very pleasurable experiences and not a source of stress.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the balance that you look for there?
Existing psychopathology can be brought into the context of health. So here, a mentally unhealthy person can develop an unhealthy relationship with health concepts. This is called orthorexia. So obsessions with cleanliness, excessive fear of toxic substances at home or in an environment, extreme exercise. These things can lead to forms of body dysmorphia. The question for me is whether these self-trackers induce such behavior in healthy people. And while I think it's possible, I don't think it is a big issue. It could be an issue in vulnerable people that might not be mentally unhealthy in the moment, but it can accelerate them towards that area. In terms of the quality of the data, I think the question for me is not how precise they can be, but is it precise enough to do what you want? So we're trying to change behavior here. That's the main focus. And if that's the case, then what you want is it to be precise enough for it to be believable and also to not be misleading. If you believe the data and then you tie that back to helping a person stay mindful of their daily goals, I call a lot of things in health mundane but meaningful. They are really boring on a day-to-day basis, and they're easy to overlook and forget. And these trackers can actually help keep it current. It can keep it top of mind. So that's part of the value. And about reducing pleasurable experiences, I prefer to view these as these health promoting systems in a positive light. So for example, I've averaged 10,000 steps a day for over a decade, and my Fitbit has really encouraged that personal history. I enjoy walking. It's part of my personal mental health routine. The fact that I track my steps makes that behavior more fun for me. I think of steps, for instance, like time. You want to have it on your wrist where you can glance down and just get an in-moment idea of where you stand. And then if you empower that with value, then it can help shift how you guide the rest of your day. I've been busy. I've been sitting here working on this paper for hours of this blog. Let me get up and walk around. Let me get some steps. So I'm proud of the fact that I've earned 10,000 steps a day for over a decade. I plan on continuing that behavior for a long time. And I feel like I probably wouldn't have done that if I didn't have that daily feedback to focus on it.
You know, for some reason, the Washington, D.C. Metro used to give me like hundreds of thousands of steps whenever I ride on it on the tracker. You know, it's just huge amounts of steps. You know, with these trackers, I think they also can be good. One of the things I find annoying about them is they have more precision and they offer more precision than the accuracy would warrant, especially intra-individually, right? Mm-hmm. So like if you look at sleep, you have somebody that's got some kind of issue with REM sleep and they're not in a state of complete paralysis.
Yeah.
So they get the wrong result.
Mm-hmm.
They draw the wrong conclusion. Mm-hmm. That's not to say it's a bad device. I have one, right? Mm-hmm. It requires education, I think.
That's right. There you go. So handing people powerful devices without any accompanying information is a really incomplete system. Hence the loop model, where you have the why and it contextualizes the tracking.
Right. That's what I was thinking. It tees up your sort of thing.
Yeah. And I've always, it's not super popular because people like the detail. But again, I focus with my sleep mostly on what time do I go to bed, which is something that I can take action on. And so what is my sleep period? How long am I staying in bed? So it's timing and period that I focus on. Very, very simple. But I do look at the sleep stages. I also know that they have only a certain degree of accuracy, and they're also homeostatic in that you might get a lot of REM sleep one night and then you're going to get less the next night. And that's not a sign of worse sleep on that particular night. So it's with these types of things, it's kind of like bioimpedance. It's better to look at trends than specific data points for a certain day. And most of us don't have problems getting enough slow wave sleep or REM sleep. But again, a lot of these things also can be encouraged with proper behaviors during the day. That's where a lot of the action takes place to improve your sleep. So if you do see a trend towards deeper sleep time, elongated sleep, etc., by modifying your relationship with alcohol or coffee, you can educate on those things and how they affect sleep. When people see their own data, it can really create faith that that is really happening in them. And in the world of information that we can be drowning in, that can really help that point hit home. So I see them as being really positive, but it's always better if they can be paired with some education around the device, not just handing people the device itself and say, good luck.
Yeah, I agree with that. And sort of moving from the why to the action steps in your model, one of the important things you mentioned was goals, goal setting, right? And one of the things with some devices that may not be optimal is the device taking information from you and presetting goals. Those may not be my goals, right? So if my watch or my device tells me, oh, you've met your movement goals today, or you've met this or that, well, that may not be my goal, right? So that's the other aspect of this is I know what you get into in this approach, which is precision or personalization.
Yeah.
And, it's not a one size fits all goal based on everybody who's 55 years of age, et cetera.
So let's talk about the concept of health itself. In 1948, the World Health Organization defined health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Now, this has been criticized as being very demanding, hard to accomplish a state of health by that definition. What are your thoughts on the definition, and is the criticism fair?
Yeah, so a little context there. In 1945, the United Nations was formed, and the purpose of that was to create better relationships between countries, to promote social well-being, and one of their objectives was to create a global health organization. And so that led to the formation of the World Health Organization, and a part of their constitution, they wanted to create a definition for health. So before this time, there was no unity on what the concept was, and that was one of the goals. After it had been launched, criticism did point to the fact that it is very demanding. Who here can say, I have complete physical, mental, and social well-being? So it feels like an unattainable task, that nobody's healthy under that definition. So then we can look at also two different types of perspectives, negative and positive perspectives. And that doesn't mean pessimistic and optimistic. Negative means by the absence of something. So health is the absence of disease, where positive versions or perspectives would actually include health being more than that. It's the absence of disease plus something else, vitality and flourishing. So in 1986, they met again and revised the concept. And they described health as the ability for the body to withstand stressors in the environment, infection, disease, injury, but also as a resource for life. And that perspective, I think, is especially helpful in today's world, where health isn't something that you have until you don't, but it's actually something, when viewed in this way, as a resource for your life, to live the life that you want, that can help you function in society. And with that in mind, then health becomes current. It's not something that is in the distant future, but is something that is here and now. And that is something that is sorely lacking. So that is the evolution of the definition. And really, it's one that I appreciate. The new version I appreciate very much. The last thing I'll say is that they also described health as not the purpose of your life. So working on it is it's in the background to help you live the life you have. It's not what you should be dedicating all your time to.
This kind of amateur philosophizing is the kind of thing that I would expect the United Nations to do. You get laughed out of philosophy 101.
And then following that, Suresh Rattan, a biogerontologist at Aarhus University in Denmark, defined health in a little bit different way as the maintenance of homeodynamic space. So what is that space? What is it comprised of?
So the previous definition is great, but to then take it a step further and look at a more biological definition, Suresh had put forward this idea of the homeodynamic space, which really has three different parts to it. It is the ability of a biological organism to respond to stresses in the environment, to then clear that damage, and then to undergo a process of remodeling. Now, how well you can handle various stressors, clear the damage, and rebuild will then determine the size of your homeodynamic space. Now, outcomes or measurable biomarkers of the homeodynamic space are things like robustness and also resilience. So robustness is how much you can tolerate now. An example, if we put this whole idea into the concept of, let's say, exercise, what size of a workout could you handle right now? And that's robustness. Resilience is then how quickly can you then adjust to the training stimulation? Does it take 1 day? Does it take 5? And how completely? So you could think of, if you're undergoing a workout program, how quickly can you respond to the stress that you put your body under, and how much of a magnitude of increased physical capacity can you add over time. All of those are reflecting the homeodynamic space. And it's a good model, but it's not the only thing that matters, because we as humans all have our own life history. All organisms do, and that's determined by evolutionary processes that determine how long it takes for us to mature, how long our life is, when we reproduce. And so that is really the backdrop curve that this homeodynamic space fits on top of. So you have this multifactorial system that is determining how robust you are at any given time. And then if we look at elements of robustness, we can certainly look at longevity, but there's other ways to view health as well. So around puberty, you have the least mortality across the lifespan. You develop different capacities, like your peak hearing is at 5, you have your peak strength at 18, and your peak lung capacity at age 20. So we can look at aggregates of your health, and we can also look at individual times when different components peak. And then in the aging process, you then have what's called the homeostasis, which is a decline in function and resistance and resilience.
Where do they get 18 as peak strength? I mean, that's not the experience in strength sports.
Yeah.
Is that because these people are so trained that they're outliers with respect to the general population? Because you do not achieve peak strength at 18 for any kind of a power sport.
Yeah. So that I thought about that, because it seems that power declines.
Power declines radically as we age. That's why old guys can't jump.
Yeah.
But strength and even power sports, you don't peak at 18.
Yeah, you can continue to, strength seems to persist longer. So this is probably in a population of untrained people. So I would say that marker isn't reflective of personal capacity of what you can do with strength if you're working at it directly, but rather in free living people that are not training for strength, when do they experience their peak strength in the lifespan? That's
what I would suspect it is, but I just wanted to bring that out because listeners will say, hey, there's no strength sport where you're at your peak at 18.
Yep.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
Having done a lot of strength training research and aging research, I would agree with that. I think, as we've already indicated, power does decline more precipitously. And it's interesting that the power decline, not the strength decline, but the power decline aligns very well with years of retirement from most events or sports that involve explosiveness.
Mm-hmm.
So, early to mid 30s, you're done because power starts to go.
Yeah,
that's right.
STEM Talk is an educational service of the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, a not-for-profit research lab pioneering groundbreaking technologies aimed at leveraging and extending human cognition, perception, locomotion, and resilience.
Let's move ahead a little bit. You use the term actual health, which is a concept that is core to your upcoming book, co-authored with STEM Talk guest Josh Turknick. You've called that book both philosophical and tactical. Can you tell us what you mean by actual health?
Yeah. So actual health is a term that we've been using to describe the book now. So the actual title might change in the future, but we needed to call it something so we could refer to it. What we like about it is that actual means existing in fact, and that would be contrasted with what is intended or expected or believed. And so we can have beliefs about what might affect something, but then we need to look at the actual effects, observe those and see what really works. And that's why I like that title, what actually works in order to help a person be more healthy. The reason we describe it as philosophical and tactical is because you need to have a broader understanding of what health is so that you understand if you're actually achieving real health. An incomplete definition around it can help us, what might promote us to focus entirely on only certain parts and not other important parts. So that's the idea. And the arc of it is to look at what health is, what shapes the health, being humans, the evolutionary process that shapes what health is for us, what influences health once we're into the world, what are all the different factors that then will affect how healthy a person is across the life cycle, then what does health look like? And what does healthcare look like? How does our system support that? And where are some missing areas that we need to fill in order for us to get better outcomes? And then this is to use a term that Josh has created. How do we win at this game of health? Putting in the context of a game that you play every day in your life. It has to be personalized to you. And that game can change from day to day. But then that is ultimately the tactical part. How do we take the philosophy and understanding of what health is and understand our context in the broader world of what's supporting our health and what areas are missing? And then how do you help yourself do better with that new type of information?
Let's talk a little bit about sort of a major initiative that you have now, which is developing the concept of a health performance expert. And before we get into that, maybe set the stage a little bit. What, in your view, are the gaps in the current healthcare system, and how might these best be filled? And part of that is this health performance expert.
This is a concept that I came up with about a year ago and started to write about it, not in public format, but also to speak to people that I respect to get feedback on the idea. The backdrop is, if we think about our healthcare system, people recognize it as a sick care system. So the tools of our healthcare system are diagnostics and procedures, referrals, medications. When you go to your doctor, you're not necessarily getting evaluated for the best possible path to health. You're getting evaluated for working within the tools of the sick care system. And it leads to some frustration because we have an increasing awareness now that medications aren't the best way to make us healthier across life. They're not necessarily the best ways to solve chronic disease. So we talked earlier about the loop model and lifestyle medicine or lifestyle health, yet we don't really have a position in society that is considered a general expert, like a primary care doctor is a general expert. So you go to primary care, secondary care, or tertiary care, and we don't have a system like that where you can go get an advanced degree in all things that affect your health. You can become a nutritionist, an exercise physiologist, you can get a degree in behavioral sciences, but at the core of it, you can't go to one of those specialists and have them fill the bucket of what health is. And so that position is lacking. And because it's lacking in society, we also don't know who to go to round out that conversation around medicine and health promotion, keeping healthy people healthier. If you think even from the perspective of the sick care system, the word for wellness is prevention, which tells you everything about what the orientation is for sick care. You're preventing a disease. It's all about the disease.
It's not even that good. It's about diagnosing and treating the disease.
That's right. So prevention is simply early diagnosis.
And most places aren't even to prevention.
They call it that, but it's still using the tools of the system. Early diagnosis. Well, you're showing signs of high blood glucose. You don't have a blood glucose over 126 with a history of diabetes, so you're not diabetic yet, but you're pre-diabetic. Let's see if we can start to give you some counseling. Ideally, we want a sick care system that is really robust. We want to continue to create medications that are innovative, have advanced surgical techniques. We want to help spread access and make it affordable. All that stuff we want, but we also want to have a healthcare system that prevents the need for those, right? So the idea that I share is you never want to break your leg, but if you do, you want a sick care system that can help get you back up to full strength. But if we think about earlier, what was the term that I had used? Digital health training. Doesn't have to be digital, but training is something that helps a person embody knowledge that then helps them direct their life differently. If you live according to the default modern environment, you can see many people developing chronic disease early in life and then adding on and developing more chronic diseases over time. We can live very different trajectories depending on what we know and what we try to do. And so that our baseline of simply just living in modern society is what we're trying to do better than. And the way to help here is to start training people when they're very young. So the health performance expert would create experts at that, and positions where they could work in society is working with young people, working with different socioeconomic groups, working as the chief health officer at every company over a certain size. Also working with the sick care system in a harmonious way so that if a person comes in and has, let's say, a myocardial infarction and then is on a medication, but then also we want to get them into an exercise program and a better nutrition program, they can work there as well. So there's many different roles that this position could fill. And I'm optimistic because we saw positive changes like this in the positive psychology movement. So before, psychology was focused mostly on mental illness. And some luminaries like Martin Seligman and others said, why can't we use the same scientific rigor to look at what helps a person thrive, what creates a good life? Now we see positive psychology departments at universities all over the world, and it's a perfect analog for what we would want to see here with the positive health movement, which really has similar ambitions: improving quality of life, helping people thrive, helping people with the performance of their life, the other side of your health, not just the absence of disease, but health as a resource. How do we maximize that resource to help you live your life?
So that's a great explanation and a distinction between the sort of two arms that would be in harmony. Maybe a simple way to think of it, at least in my mind, is the sick care system is a reaction system. Mm-hmm. And what you're describing is an action-oriented system to balance the reaction-oriented system.
That's right.
And I like that you see this important role developing independently, not in opposition to, and perhaps in coordination with, but independently of what you're calling the sick care system, because this will not happen within the existing medical framework. If anything, they will be antagonistic to it. And to accomplish it, you would have to completely change medical training, and would probably develop physicians actually less good at sick care. And sick care matters.
Yeah.
When you're sick, that's the person you want to see.
That's right.
So I think it is important that this be handled differently. There are people that play this role now in society, and it's almost in every case, they're inappropriately educated for the role.
Yeah.
Either on YouTube or podcasts.
That's right.
Or they're somehow personality gurus, in social media. And it's really, it really needs a whole curriculum developed.
That's right. A formal educational track, a curriculum, many different minds thinking about this. What would a general education in health promotion look like? And how do we help training people to help others take action in their life? We recognize that it is very important, but there isn't a formal system that is designed to instantiate these ideas within all sorts of individuals across society. And so this is a big gaping hole. And I've realized that if you fixed all of the issues within the healthcare system as it exists now, we would still have unsatisfactory outcomes because of the limitations of what that does. What it does is very important, and it's not a way to undermine or undercut their value. But we need something that has a different mindset about when we take action and what we do. And I'd like to put it in this context. Imagine this fictitious, unrealistic scenario where you could go to your doctor once a quarter for an hour and only talk about lifestyle health. Well, think about if you could, is that enough? So first of all, it's unrealistic, but is it also enough?
It's also the wrong person to be talking to.
Right.
So with some exceptions, and there are beautiful exceptions.
Absolutely.
These are not the right people to talk to about health.
Some of the most knowledgeable people that I know on health are doctors, but it is because they started with an excellent base of education about the human body, and then through interest on their own, they developed a knowledge base on their own.
Right, but they're outliers.
They're outliers. And so you have very big diversity in the quality of health promoting information that you get from doctors. And so, so not only is it untenable for them to get enough time within the sick care system to adequately help a person become trained at health, right? You wouldn't want to go to your soccer coach once a quarter for an hour. That's not enough. Or have your child go to their teacher an hour for once a quarter. Not enough. So not only would doctors not have enough time, it doesn't fit into that system, but it also, even in the most idealized scenario, would not be enough. So that's why we need these separate branches. You could imagine somebody getting a dual degree in an MD and an HPE, as I call it, health performance expert, just like you could imagine someone wanting to work at the intersection of research and clinical, so an MD, Ph.D. You'll see that, but that still doesn't mean that we need to try to make all of our doctors handle all of this. It's just a different type of position, and it would require different amounts of time and education and training for those people and how they operate in the world.
It's interesting. In my time as a professor in a school of medicine, directing courses for medical students, the students who came to medical school with a prior advanced degree in something related to this idea, right? Whether it was a master's in exercise science or a master's in nutrition science or what have you. Their orientation was far different. And as a student of medicine now, I found them to be different in their thinking, different in how they were applying their new knowledge they were gaining during medical training. And so I love the idea of some combined, cross-disciplinary training. But Ken's exactly right. It's not going to be embedded in traditional schools of medicine education. It doesn't work.
It doesn't work. If you think about the allocation of time.
And the economics don't work.
The economics don't work. And you would have to tack on another couple of years of training on an already long process of medical education, and then you wouldn't have the time to sufficiently help people. Now, I do think that doctors should have this education because you would want the sick care side to always reinforce the importance of the lifestyle side, the self-care side. But acknowledging and promoting it is not the same thing as training. You can reinforce that the ideas are important in a person, but it's not enough.
And medical school has changed, but it won't scratch the itch that you're describing.
Yeah.
It's like engineering has changed. Engineering schools were very, very almost like engineering boot camp. And in some ways, they were better then than now. And what I don't want to do is see medical schools get so into things other than what they should be doing that they become bad or not as good, let's say, at their primary task, which is diagnosing and addressing disease. I think it's better to handle the health issue outside of that.
Yeah, that's right.
Because medical school is long and hard as it is.
Yeah.
And there's a tendency to water things down and make them kumbaya.
Yeah. An important point for me, too, that I think can tie the knot on some of these ideas is we don't have to, again, live our life simply for disease prevention. So within the health performance side, a lot of the work that these experts will be doing with individuals is showing them how a healthy lifestyle is helping them live a better life, be the best version of themselves. So you can imagine this in the context of a workplace environment, showing the sensitive marker of brain performance and how it relates here and now to how you're living your life. So a lot of things related to health can be what I call meaningful but invisible. So if, let's say you had a 15% improvement in memory over an 8-week period, that's substantial. We would take it. But you might acclimate to the effect, since you're acclimating to it slowly, you might not even recognize that it's happened. And that can actually happen in both directions, improvements in performance and decrements in performance. And so that's something that we have to kind of work with as well. But these types of systems can help a person understand the value of how daily practices add to their thinking ability and strength, and how they're interacting socially. And, good health and high performance isn't reserved simply for our biggest moments in life, but also serves as this energetic undercurrent for all the small things that we need to do as well. How we're showing up in life and what we choose to participate in, what kind of hobbies we have, what kind of relationships we have with our friends and our spouses. All of that stuff requires a lot of energy, and we want to maximize personal energy in our lives. Health performance can help you with that.
In your TED Talk on optimizing light for health, you open by talking about the impact of microgravity on health. Can you talk a little bit about that? Why you chose to open with that topic?
That was a plot device to propel the narrative forward. So I like to educate typically by finding an extreme example that's easy to head nod to, and then relate that back to perhaps the topic at hand that might be harder to see because of, let's say, lifestyle or ubiquitousness of, let's say, some health impairing factor. So the talk itself was on how to optimize light for health. But what I wanted to show was how technology shapes how we live and can put us in environments to which our bodies are unfamiliar. So the simile of light being like space travel is very vivid. You can see somebody going into that microenvironment, and once they're there, there's really serious health consequences that happen right away. Changes in gene expression, loss of bone matter, and these changes can last for a while. So that is easy to understand. The next part of that is that if we could adjust our relationship with gravity on Earth, we might take part in that. It could make us, imagine putting on these suits where we could run faster, jump higher, We would want them. It'd be fun. But then we would have to develop a relationship where we got enough gravity in our day, right? So that we didn't suffer the same consequences here on Earth as the astronauts do in space. That idea reflects the same concept that we have with light. Artificial light is uniform in our environment, and it's easy to stare into these screens that give us a daylight signal right before bed. So there, it is shifting and affecting our physiology and in negative ways, and we now need to learn how to interact with technology so it doesn't overwhelm us. I'm a fan of technology, but it also requires a certain degree of education on how to interact with it in a way where it doesn't sap you of your health.
Let's discuss the difference between age and aging. We often think about these as a continual decline from some kind of a peak, wherever that is, and then a slow, gradual decline into a sort of aged, frail existence. Could you talk a little bit about your views on this?
Yeah. So age, of course, there's chronological age, which is just the clock. From when you're born, that clock keeps on ticking. So if you're 20 years old, you know how many years you have aged. Internally, however, we are aging at different rates. And some of that is determined by genes, and a lot of it is determined by our relationship with the environment. When you think about lifespan, we have our essential lifespan, or natural lifespan. And this is the period of time where we are given as a species to fulfill our Darwinian purpose of life, which is reproduction. Now, many species will perish right after they spawn. So you can think of salmon. They mate and then they die. Humans have a protracted or elongated period after the essential lifespan, and that is considered the period of aging. We do see a decline in a lot of function from our previous peaks, but I consider that period of aging really a vulnerability zone. We will have a decline, but we can significantly affect the trajectory by how we live. In fact, we are more protected from an unhealthy lifestyle when we are younger because evolution has prioritized robustness in our youth so that we can survive and reproduce. Later, however, we are less protected from an unhealthy lifestyle. And so if weeks to months to even years go by where you are doing something that is causing an acceleration of damage, then you're going to suffer the consequences of that in the forms of frailty, sarcopenia, increased vulnerability to chronic diseases of all sorts. So that's not necessarily something that we must undergo. If we continue to live a very healthy life, then we can actually preserve what seems to be surprising or remarkable levels of health late into life. But you have to maintain that pattern long term. And unfortunately, we can't, for many people, simply start to teach them when the issues occur. That's why we need a lifetime of training. If you think about the world today, there's so much change that we have to deal with. You have a changing base of information. 20 years ago, no model of health included information on microbiome or circadian rhythms. We have a changing environment. So some new technology can be introduced into the world and is adopted overnight by the globe. Our environment is changing fast. And we also have a changing you. You're a different person now than you were 10 years ago and 10 years before that. So our interests change, our motivations change. And so we have to work with all of that as we get older to then figure out who are we now, what motivates us, and how do we then figure out the right way to sustain our health currently? What is the guiding purpose or principle that is driving us to stay at our best? That's how is aging a gradual and inevitable loss of decline in function and meaning? I like to look at that quite differently, actually, that aging is also a period where you've had time to accumulate more experience. And if we look at, for instance, the grandparent hypothesis, that states that we live as long as we do because rearing young children takes a lot of energy. And we've increased the fertility of our children by then supporting them, by getting calories, by taking care of the young ones, but also by helping to establish better social harmony, by using our aggregated wisdom through life experience to then help the tribe stay stable And that would also create a better environment for successful reproduction and survival of your offspring. So we have continual meaning. And the way I like to think of an example, I have a few programmer friends who've been very successful. And as they advance in their career, they tend to lose touch with the current language of programming as they move into management positions. So at one point, they had great prowess as a programmer themselves, and that was acknowledged and seen. And then they become a manager where they lose touch with programming itself. But instead, they have an influence on now 25 different programmers and how well they are performing in their life. And it's kind of an interesting analogy, which we could see with aging, that as you get older, you can still help previous generations really thrive. And that can be a guiding purpose that can help us want to maintain our health longer into the lifespan.
You mentioned earlier in the discussion, you mentioned, you just did it as an analogy, but human spaceflight. It's funny that I always think of it this way. I don't think of aging as a clock function. I think of it as we're all space travelers. You often hear human spaceflight compared with aging. They say, well, it's many of the same deprivations, loss of muscle, loss of bone, cardiac changes. It goes on and on and on. Now, there's some that are unique to spaceflight, not reflected in aging. But if you think about it, I've made 67 laps around the sun, traveled a much greater distance than anybody ever did in a spacecraft. And it's a nicer way to think about it than sort of 67 years old. No, I'm a space traveler, and I've went quite a long ways, and I hope to go many more laps around the sun. And I think it's just a nicer way to think about it. And it's also can lead you to a different lifestyle in a way, if you think of yourself that way, as opposed to somebody on the backside of a clock that's running down.
That's right. That's right. What you just mentioned stimulated a thought in me. So a lot of work with those astronauts are designed to help them do things that prevent the clear loss of function that you see if a person were to simply exist in a rocket that's in the microgravity environment of outer space. If they did nothing, the consequences would be worse.
That's the analogy I'm making, right? Because if you think of yourself as a space traveler, then, and you are, right? You're going pretty fast, I assure you.
Right,
you would do things differently, right?
I'm less optimistic about going to different planets and space travel, just because we would essentially need to create an environment within a space capsule that was identical to that on Earth. And all these different ways that we're not even paying attention to, as those are off from what we're adapted for, that would lead to really serious consequences.
Oh, for sure.
Accelerated damage.
This will never be healthy.
No.
I mean, the radiation, these are kinds of radiation we don't even have on Earth. The argument isn't that it's healthy. It was just, is it even doable?
Right.
Yeah. You mentioned the grandparent hypothesis, talked a little bit about that.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that in the context of preserving cognitive function as we age and the importance of working to do that?
So that idea, if we have a shift of priorities as we enter into different decades and parts of our life, then what might be a priority later in life? Well, if part of what evolution has shaped is a person who has aggregated wisdom and can share that wisdom with their tribe and improve their survival, the better wisdom that they share, the more harmony they can create, the more technology that had been developed can be passed down. It's a very valuable role. We know that Alzheimer's is a very scary and real consequence of unhealthy lifestyles today, and we don't really know how to address it. So it's been mostly a failure. All pharmaceutical efforts to try to intervene in Alzheimer's disease have failed, despite serious efforts that have been given and a lot of money that has been spent. And so part of this comes from a demand coupling hypothesis created by Dr. Josh Turknet, and Josh and Tommy, another former STEM Talk guest, have published a paper talking about this, that the best way to keep your brain sharp is to put it under demands. Now, when you're young, you have a lot of demands that are a part of growing up. You're learning balance, you're learning how to interact socially. Just being young and growing creates a tremendous amount of demands for the brain. You get into midlife and you start working at your job and you start to develop skills, and we start to rely on those skills, but those become more automatic as you get good at them and you do them a lot. Then in this aging period, you have different mindsets. You have disease vulnerable mindsets, and I think disease preventative mindsets. And a vulnerable mindset would continue to disengage in life, do less cognitive demanding things, and just do the stuff that you're good at. A less vulnerable mindset would actually have you pursuing mentally challenging tasks that are novel. So learning a new instrument, learning a new language, working on choreography, doing things that actually involve a large swath of the brain. We see those as the types of behaviors that create enough stimulus where you then have transferable benefit to other thinking that you do in your life. A disappointment with brain training games is that when you're doing something that's two-dimensional, it might be cognitively challenging, but it might not necessarily transfer so that you're better at other parts of who you are. But when you're doing things that involve a large part of the brain, like dance or jujitsu, then those are the types of activities that can keep that brain sharp and probably are also going to help us avoid dementia and things like Alzheimer's disease. So that's the idea, is that we have to keep working, and that purpose of keeping your brain sharp is a really goal that we can aspire to at this phase in life.
Can you talk a little bit about your personal practices to maintain or improve overall health? What in your mind are the key ingredients?
Yeah, so I do a lot of different things, many of them small. So I'll just mention a few. But high level, I think about health and what that looks like for me every day in the context of that day. Overall, as I mentioned earlier, I try to maintain 10,000 steps a day. I get about 20 minutes of sunshine. I've also started to wear a rucksack. So this is a weighted backpack that has 35 pounds in it, and I carry it around with me to deconvenience my life. It helps to make my life more physically active. I created something called Intune Training, which I'll mention. So Intune stands for integrative and opportunistic. Now, in modern society, we tend to think of physical activity by clustering it into one unit where we get all of our physical activity, then we go about living our life. Intune is really a shift in a mindset. So you see your whole day as an opportunity to do movement here and there. What I like about it is that it fits nicely into the practical fabric of my life. I do an email, then I do 5 push-ups. I have to go to the bathroom, and on the way back, I do 10 squats. And you can aggregate a considerable amount of movement by the end of the day. What's really interesting is if you were to look at a week with no movement at all, you couldn't fit in the workout you wanted to, and you compare that to a week where you actually ended up doing 50 push-ups and squats in one day, and what that looked like every day, and counted up the totals, like that's a lot more movement than the week where I missed the workout that I wanted to go to. So when we think just in workouts, it's more vulnerable. We're going to miss out the opportunity for other forms of movement in our life. What I like about it is it also stimulates mental performance. Think about how lucid and clear-minded you feel after a not too intense but solid workout. Can you engineer that state across your day so that you perform better at it? I love that. And recently I've started to use the virtual reality app Supernatural. I'm very shocked and impressed by how cool it is. But imagine you put on the headset and you're standing on some glacier in Iceland, and in the distance, a portal opens up and these orbs start flying at you, sometimes from different angles. You're having to react and move and change positions. It's very, very dynamic. So in the morning, I use a lower intensity setting to get my brain up and awake. Then I do some Intune throughout the day, push-ups here and there, sit-ups. And then at the end of the day, I might do another set of Supernatural, which is a more intense cardiovascular workout. Very, very impressed by that. And I also think it's an excellent, probably one of the best brain training tools as well, given what we just talked about dynamic movement and the demands that places on the brain.
Yeah, it's interesting. You touched on something there that I just wanted to highlight. My message to my 3 children throughout their education has always been exercise prior to your exams.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Makes sense. And this whole concept of exercise is a thing that we do apart from life.
Mm-hmm.
There's no other animal that lives like this.
Mm-hmm.
And humans didn't live like this until very, very recently. I was just recently, unfortunately, in Washington, D.C., and I was looking at a bridge. And there were hundreds of young, leotard-clad joggers, whatever jogging is, running slowly across the bridge. And I thought, when this bridge was built in the 1800s, people would have looked at those people and called the insane asylum. They would have said, what are they doing? Why are they running? Who is chasing them?
Yeah.
In other words, this idea that we've sort of balkanized exercise into, and I do it too, right? Into a thing you go do is very strange. It has to do with our lifestyle so sedentary. If we don't, we'll have negative consequences.
Yeah.
But I agree with you about integrating it as much as you can. When you were in my office, did you notice anything?
Kettlebells.
Big kettlebells and other things.
Yes, the iron neck, all sorts of tools. And actually, I think all offices in the future should look like that. It should have the place where you work and then all sorts of movement tools that help you stretch, that help you raise your heart rate, that help you squat down. That is what I think the future office should look like. A change would be having a gym that's near your office. That's great. I'm talking about the integration of movement tools into your workspace.
Yeah, I agree with that. And we have a gym about 200 feet from our office, which is great.
Yeah.
But it's not the same as answering some emails and then swinging the kettlebell.
Yeah.
Because your heart rate goes way up and everything changes. Your whole day changes.
Yeah. And I'll be clear about my perspective. Both are good. So I don't want to hold these in opposition.
No, they're not in
this
opposition.
Verse, that getting a whole workout is great. Having a full gym to get a more intense workout is great. And its proximity to where you are can be, the farther it is, the worse. But this is a change in your mindset that it's not the only way you can get meaningful movement into your day. So I like steps because it is a marker of low intensity physical activity. The other stuff is a little bit higher intensity activity that just fits into the flow. And I talk about the permissiveness of the environment that you work in. If you're a lawyer and you're coming in a 3-piece suit every day, it might feel hard for you to do that. You can stretch and there might be a little bit of movement you can do, but then you have to think that's where you are turning knowledge into something that fits your life. I'm going to do a little bit before work, a little bit at lunch, right after work. Then now you're fitting it in a way that works for you if you can't do kettlebell swings in your day. But that is taking an idea and personalizing it to your life. That's what we all have to do with these big ideas.
Yeah, that's great. And we are our habits, right?
Yeah.
I think we've proven that over time.
Yeah.
We certainly are. If there's one thing you'd like people to remember from this episode today, what would that be?
That health is not an end state goal. There isn't a finish line. It's a process goal. And that means that it is something that we have to continually work at. A lot of people can feel daunted by how much there is to learn about health, and I understand that. Think of it rather as a lifetime journey. And every time you tap into something that actually influences, that it causes actual health, that really influences your health in a meaningful way, and you learn it right, you have the rest of your life to exploit that knowledge for your benefit. So I see that as exciting, that there's always more to learn. There's always ways to continue to shape how I'm interacting with the world to benefit myself, and that it doesn't end somewhere. You want to find a way to make it a part of your daily to weekly habit. So what am I learning? What am I doing? And can you have that effort aggregate over time, compound, so that you continually become better at this thing we call health, so that you're maximizing it, so that your own life is benefiting to the maximal degree. That's how I'd like for people to think about it. And that is in difference to, what's the top 3 things that you should be thinking about? It's sort of like if we put it into the context of soccer, again, what are the top 3 things you should be thinking about with soccer? I don't even know how to answer that. You want to play the game well, and a lot of things matter. You want to get good at all those things that matter so that you can win that game. And if you artificially choose 3 different things, it might be things you might want to focus on in the here and now, but it's not necessarily, those things will never be more important than everything else that matters too. So health is better when you look at it across all the disciplines that do affect you versus the significant investment in one area, trying to extract, blood out of an orange, so to speak. So that's our opportunity. It's a fun process. The more fun it is for you, then the more you will likely stick with it. Doesn't mean every moment has to be fun. Sometimes it requires hard work, which in retrospect is satisfying. But that is how I would like for people to view it, a lifetime of opportunity to understand ourselves better and for us to benefit.
Well, that's a great takeaway. And this has been a fine discussion. Thank you, Dan. You did a great job.
Thank you.
And thank you also for the lecture you gave here at IHMC last night. It was a big crowd, and they all seemed well pleased.
Thank you.
So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcus.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Well, that was a fun interview. I really like Dan's concept of actual health. I'm looking forward to the upcoming book that he has, co-authored with Josh Turknick. Josh was our guest on episode 130, and the discussion with him was also fascinating. I'm glad to see these two collaborating. I imagine their book will have insights that our listeners will be interested in quite a bit.
I agree. Josh and Dan actually make a great team, and I'm looking forward to their book. And Dan is so right about the gaps in our current healthcare system, and I think his idea of a health professional expert or a health performance expert is a good one. What I like about Dan in particular is he doesn't just talk about these things, but he's actually trying to close these gaps. If any of our listeners haven't had a chance to check out humanOS or Dan's podcast, humanOS Radio, I promise it will be well worth your time. Both his podcast and website have a wealth of information on ways to improve your sleep, as well as your general health span and perhaps even your lifespan.
Well, today was great. This is Marcus Baumann signing off.
And this is Ken Ford saying goodbye until we meet again on STEM Talk.
Thank you for listening to STEM Talk. We want this podcast to be discovered by others, so please take a minute to go to iTunes to rate the podcast and perhaps even write a review. More information about this and other episodes can be found at our website, stemtalk.us. There, you can also find more information about the guests we interview.